The ridge was already on fire when Sub-Commander Irin Haluvas put her boot on the lip of the trench and shouted the withdraw. She shouted it once in the squadron channel and a second time in open band, so the human company holding the lower slope would hear it, and the second time she had to put her chest into it, because the rotor wash of the breakaway ships was already coming down the cut, and the air was full of grit and the deep, awful rhythm of the enemy's plate cannon working through the rock half a kilometer to the east. Below her, in the dry creek, the human company was moving in the slow, disciplined motion of men ordered to retreat in formation and not in panic, and above her, the 4 flight mounts of her squadron were already lifting, all 4 except one. The small one, of course, had not lifted. The small one was still on the ground. Iron saw her through the smoke, halfway down the burnt slope, perfectly still beside the stretcher of one specific human soldier, head lowered. The wing she had broken 3 months ago at the Tanish crossing held at the angle she always held it now, which was the angle of an apology she had never been allowed to finish. The man on the stretcher was the issue. He had taken a fragment through the lower leg 6 minutes ago, and the 2 human medics carrying him had been ordered, like the rest of the company, to fall back, and the small one would not move, would not lift, would not, Iron could see it in the cant of the neck, even consider lifting until the man on the stretcher was lifted with her. The withdraw order was a withdraw order. The small one knew it. The small one had refused it. Irin swore in her own tongue, climbed up out of the trench, and ran down the ridge toward the small one through air that tasted of cooked iron, and the future, although she did not know it yet, began that minute to write itself in a way that would surprise her for the rest of her life. 41 years later, on a cool, slow morning in the upper terrace garden of the Haluvas family home on the planet Errol, a very old sub-commander, retired, sat in a wicker chair and looked out across the lower valley and watched a creature the size of a small barn move slowly across the orchard. The creature was the small one. The small one had grown for 41 years in the way her kind grew, very slow and very steady, and she was now larger than the lemon trees, and her wing, the wing that had been broken at the Tanish crossing, was held at a comfortable angle now, the way an old soldier holds an old shoulder, the way Iron herself held her own bad hip. The small one was carrying a basket. Today the basket held 3 jars of pickled plums and a folded blanket and what looked, from the terrace, like a child's wooden horse. Iron watched her cross the orchard, and she thought, as she did every morning at this hour, about the ridge. It was the same ridge it had always been. It would be the same ridge tomorrow. Below her, in the long sun of the orchard, the small one, whose name was Tash, although in the squadron rolls she had been listed for 2 years only as Mount 7 reduced status, probationary, paused beside the well, set the basket down with the careful precision she set everything down with, and looked up at the terrace. Iron raised one hand. Tash, far below, dipped her great head the way a person bows a head to a person, and then she picked the basket up again and went on. The wooden horse, Iron thought, was for the great-grandson, the grandson's son, Kor. The boy's name was Kor. Tash never forgot a name. That was one of the things Iron had had 41 years to learn about her. Back on the ridge, on the day of the withdrawal, Iron reached the small one through smoke and shouted at her in 3 languages, and the small one would not move. "Lift," Iron said in the squadron tongue. "Lift, you idiot. Lift now." The small one looked at her with one enormous yellow eye and did not lift. "That is an order," Iron said. The small one lowered her head until her snout was almost on the chest of the man on the stretcher, and the man on the stretcher, who was conscious, who had been conscious the whole time, who had been quiet the whole time the way certain humans are quiet when they have decided that being loud will be no help to anyone, put his good hand up and laid it flat against the side of the small one's face, and said something soft that Iron could not hear over the burning grass. The small one closed her eye. The small one did not lift. The 4th flight mount, the lead of the squadron, an enormous gray-green warrior named Vault, who outweighed Tash 4 to 1, banked back over the ridge and roared down at the smoke. Iron heard Vault's rider, Second Lieutenant, on the squadron channel, telling her in clipped formal voice to leave the small one. "The cannon is at 600 meters. Leave the small one." Iron did not leave the small one. Iron made, in that minute, the decision that would cost her 2 ranks and a posting and the respect of 3 uncles. And that would, in the long, slow ledger of her life, be the single best decision she ever made. She bent down beside the stretcher. She got her own arms under it. "Lift," she said again. This time not to Tash, but to the man on the stretcher. "Lift with me," when she lifts, and the man on the stretcher, who was bleeding through the tourniquet, and whose name was Private Owen Merrick of the human Third Mountain, looked at her, a Trethine officer he had never seen before, in a war he was not supposed to be useful in, and nodded once, and gripped the stretcher rail with his good hand, and Iron counted 3 in her tongue, and Tash, very gently, the way the small one did everything, slid the long hook of her undamaged wing under the stretcher's other end, and lifted. The cannon found the ridge 10 seconds after they cleared the ground. The smoke behind them, when Iron risked a look back from Tash's shoulder, was where the ridge had been. In the upper terrace garden, 41 years later, the great-grandson came up the stone stair with the wooden horse in his hand. He was 4. He had his great-grandfather's brown hair and his great-grandmother's solemn mouth, and he climbed the stair the way small children climb stairs, one careful foot at a time, and when he reached the terrace he held the wooden horse up to Iron and said, in his small, clear voice, "She gave me this." "Did she?" Iron said. "She said it was Grandpa's. It was Grandpa's. Did Grandpa give it to her?" Iron thought about that for a moment. She watched Tash, far below in the orchard, set the empty basket down against the well stone and stretch the bad wing out to the sun the way she always stretched it out at mid-morning. "He gave it to her once," Iron said, "and she has been giving it back ever since. Why? Because that is what she does. Why? Because once, a very long time ago, she did not lift when she was told to lift, and he did not die. And after that, she decided that everything anyone gave her, she would give back. To one person, and then to that person's son, and then to that person's son's son, and now to you." The boy looked at the wooden horse. He turned it in his hand. It was old. It had been carved by a human private named Owen Merrick in the long quiet of a field hospital on the planet Drath, in the 3rd month after the Tannish Ridge, while his leg healed, and it had ridden in his pocket for the rest of the war, and after the war it had ridden in the pocket of his son, and after that in the pocket of his grandson, and Tash had carried each of them in turn on the long, slow visits across the rim, and Tash had been given the horse each time by the man who carried it, and Tash had given it back every single time to the next man. The wood was very smooth. 4 generations of human hands had smoothed it. "She gave it to me," the boy said. "She did. Forever. Until you give it to your son." The boy considered this with the gravity small boys reserve for instructions about objects, and then he put the wooden horse very carefully on the wicker arm of Iron's chair, the way one places a thing one has been given to keep, and he sat down on the flagstone at her feet, and he watched Tash, far below, stretch her bad wing in the sun. After a while he said, "She is very big. She is. Was she always big? No. How big was she before?" Iron looked down at her great-grandson, and the long ledger of her life turned a page in her chest, and she thought about how to tell a 4-year-old what the small one had been on the day she had refused the withdraw. "She was the smallest in the squadron," Iron said. "She was the smallest by a great deal. She had a broken wing. They had given her to me as a kind of punishment because nobody else would take her. They told me she would never be useful in a fight, and they were right. She was not useful in a fight. She was useful in something else." "What?" "In not leaving." The boy thought about that. "In not leaving who?" "In not leaving your great-grandfather, on a day when everybody else was leaving him." The boy looked back at Tash in the orchard. "She didn't leave him?" "No." "Why?" "Because she had decided he was hers." "Was he hers?" Iron smiled. The smile was a thing she rarely did. "He was hers," she said. "And she was his, and that is the whole story, and it is also the only story, and one day, when you are older, I will tell it to you properly." The boy nodded the way children nod when they have decided to accept that they will be told a thing later. He picked up the wooden horse. He held it against his chest. He went back down the stone stair, careful foot by careful foot, the way he had come up, and Iron watched him cross the courtyard below and run, on his short small legs, out into the orchard, toward the enormous quiet shape of Tash, who was waiting as she always waited, exactly where she had set the basket down. Tash, in the orchard, lowered her great head as the boy came up. The boy held the wooden horse up. Tash dipped her snout very gently until it touched the horse. Then she lifted the boy onto her shoulder, the way she had lifted Iron on the ridge, the way she had lifted 3 generations of the Merrick line across 41 years of peace, and she walked slowly, with the careful tilted gait of a creature with one bad wing, out through the lemon trees and toward the lower stream where the boy liked to throw stones. Iron watched them go. She thought, as she had thought 1,000 times, that loyalty was not a word her people had ever quite gotten right. Her people had a word for chain of command. Her people had a word for sworn brother. Her people had a word for blood debt, and a word for honor mark, and a word for the bond between a flight mount and her rider. and her people had thought for a long time that those 4 words covered everything that needed to be covered. Her people had been wrong. There was a fifth thing. The fifth thing did not have a word in her tongue. The fifth thing was what the small one had done on the ridge. The fifth thing was what the small one had been doing every morning since. And in the human tongue, Erin had eventually come to learn, the fifth thing had a name, a small word, a quiet word, an unshowy word that did not look like much in writing. The word was hers. The word was his. The word was loyalty. And it was, Erin had come to believe in her late years, the only word in any language worth a damn. The ridge had not been Erin's first action. The ridge had been her 31st. She had come up out of the academy 11 years before the war began, and she had served the long, boring patrols of the outer verge, the close patrols of the inner system, and 2 years as an aide to her uncle in the council wing offices on Errol. At the start of the war, she had been given a squadron of her own, the Trithine 11th, 4 full flight mounts and their riders, and a single auxiliary mount whose name no one had bothered to write on the roster. The single auxiliary mount had been Tash. Tash had come to the 11th not as a posting but as a problem. She had been bred on the breeding fields of Trith, and she had been the smallest of her clutch, and her wing had not set right out of the egg. By the time anyone noticed, the wing had set wrong twice, and the third resetting had been refused by Tash herself, who had bitten the wingmaster and put a long, shallow gash along his forearm with the back of her claw. The wingmaster had written that Mount 7 of Clutch 40 was unsuitable for combat duty and likely unsuitable for any duty involving flight, and the recommendation had been a quiet retirement to the breeding fields as a brood cousin. Tash had refused that too. Tash, the wingmaster, had eventually given up and written, wished to fly. The wingmaster had been overruled by a directive from the council wing office on Errol, where Erin's uncle, in the slow, careful way of uncles who knew a useful piece of leverage when they saw one, had picked up Tash's file and walked it across 2 corridors and dropped it on the desk of the personnel officer for the Trithine 11th with a note attached that read, in his small, precise handwriting, "Give this one to my niece. She will know what to do with a difficult animal." Erin had not known what to do with a difficult animal. Erin had known how to lead 4 riders and 4 well-bred warrior mounts on the patrol routes she had been given, and that had been enough on the long, boring days of the outer verge, and at the start of the war it had still been enough, and on the first day of her command of the 11th, when Tash had been brought up the ramp of the transport ship with her bad wing folded against, her flank and her great yellow eyes lowered, and her body language quite clearly that of a creature who had spent 2 years being told she was a waste, Erin had looked at her for perhaps half a minute and then turned to her second and said very quietly, "Put her at the back. Give her a ground job. She is not to be in any flight pattern." The second had nodded. The second had put Tash at the back. The ground job had been the human company. The humans had not been supposed to be on Drath. The humans had not been supposed to be involved in the Council's war with the Glani at all. They had been a curiosity at the edge of the Council's awareness for 2 decades. A young species that produced too much grain and too many ships and too many tough, quiet infantrymen for its small size. When the Council had finally agreed to let a single human company on the Drath front as observers, the result had been a single mountain company, 3rd Mountain, 240 men, on the lower slope of a ridge nobody thought the Glani would attack. The Glani had attacked the ridge. The Trithine 11th had been the closest squadron. The Trithine 11th had been ordered to provide air cover for the human company's evacuation, and the 4 warrior mounts had performed beautifully, and the small one at the back, the bad wing one, the ground job, the one Erin had told her second to keep out of every flight pattern, had been assigned by a clerk on the transport who did not know any better to a single specific human stretcher team as a ground escort. The clerk had picked the team at random. The team had been Private Owen Marrick's team. This was the thing in the long ledger of Erin's life that she had spent 41 years thinking about, the size of the accident at the start. A clerk on a transport, looking at a roster, picking a name. If the clerk had picked the team next to Marrick's team, Tash would have escorted a different stretcher, and the wooden horse would never have been carved, and the great-grandson on the terrace would not exist, and the long, quiet visits across the rim would not exist, and the 5th word for the 5th thing would never have entered Erin's vocabulary at all. A clerk, a roster, a name, the whole of 41 years. Erin, on the terrace, watched the bad wing shape of Tash carrying the great-grandson out toward the lower stream, and she thought, not for the first time, that the universe was a foolish place, and a beautiful one, and that she would, if she had been given the chance, have shaken the hand of that clerk. She had never met the clerk. She had never even learned the clerk's name. It did not matter. The clerk had done his small thing, and Tash had done her great one, and the universe had taken care of the rest. On the ridge, after the cannon found the ground where the ridge had been, Tash flew badly. She flew the way a creature with a bad wing flies when she is carrying twice her weight and the air is full of smoke. She flew low. She flew slow. Twice she dropped, and twice she caught the air again. And the stretcher between them, with Owen Marek bleeding through the tourniquet and gripping the rail, swung like a long pendulum below her belly, and Iron, who had thought she understood what fear was, learned in those 4 minutes that she had not understood it at all. They cleared the lower slope. They cleared the dry creek. They cleared the burnt grass and the rock fall and the long black line where the Glani plate cannon had walked its first salvo across the human company's line of retreat. They came down, finally half a kilometer behind the human field aid post, in a flat space of scrub grass where the medics had set up a triage canopy, and Tash landed badly and went to her knees, and the stretcher slid sideways and Iron caught it, and Owen Marek, very quietly, said something in his own tongue that Iron did not understand at the time and learned, 12 years later, was the human word for thank you. The medics took him. Tash lay on her side on the scrub grass and breathed in long, slow, rasping breaths. Irene sat down beside her bad wing and put one hand on it and did not move for a long time. Above the ridge behind them, the smoke went on, rising into the high blue sky, and somewhere very far above, in a flight pattern that no longer had a small one in it, the 4 warrior mounts of the Trithine 11th were circling and waiting for orders from a sub-commander who was no longer in the air. Second Halutan called down on the squadron channel, twice, asking where she was. Iran did not answer the second call. The first call she answered with 3 words, "I am alive." That was all she said. Second Halutan, who would later that month write a very careful report to the Council Wing Office on Iril, stating that Sub-Commander Iran Haluvas had abandoned her command position to ride a non-combat ground mount during an active withdrawal and had endangered the squadron's order in the doing of it. Second Halu, Tan, who was a careful officer and not a cruel one, had taken those 3 words in the spirit they were offered and had brought the squadron home and had said nothing on the channel the rest of the way back. The report had cost Iran 2 ranks. The report had cost her the 11th. The report had cost her the posting she had been promised on the inner patrol and a great deal of family standing on the planet Iril, where her uncles who had been pleased to see her rise were not pleased to see her fall. The report had cost her, in real terms, her career. The report had been worth it. She had decided this on the scrub grass beside Tash's bad wing before the report had been written, before she had even gotten back to base, and she had not changed her mind in 41 years. In the upper terrace garden on the cool, slow morning, the long shadow of Tash and the small shadow of the great-grandson moved together across the orchard grass and down toward the stream, and Iron sat with the wooden horse on the arm of her chair and watched them go. A young woman came up the stone stair with a tray. The young woman was Iron's granddaughter's daughter, a quiet, polite young woman of the human Trithine mixed line that had become, in the long peace, a not uncommon thing on the planet Errol. She had brown skin and Trithine crests, and her hair was the brown of the Marek line, and she carried the tray with the careful balance of a young person who had been raised to wait on an old one. "Aunt Iron," she said, "Tella. He said he would be down by the stream. He will be. With her? With her." Tella set the tray down on the low table. There was a pot of the dark spiced tea that the long piece had made a common thing across the rim. There was a small plate of seeded biscuits. There was a folded letter on the tray, sealed with the gray wax of the human council seat on Iril, addressed in the careful hand of someone Iron had not seen in 20 years. Iron looked at the seal. She did not pick the letter up. "Has she opened it?" she said. "Mother says she will not open it until you have read it." "That is wise of your mother." "Mother says it is from the Marek line." "It is." "Mother says it is from his son's son." Iron reached out after a moment and picked the letter up. The wax was warm in her hand. The hand of the writer she did not need to see. She knew the hand. She had been seeing it on every annual letter for 20 years, ever since the boy had taken over the family correspondence from his father. The boy was no longer a boy. The boy was now 63. Iron turned the letter over twice in her hand, and then she set it down on the wicker arm of her chair beside the wooden horse, and she said to Tella, "I will read it when she is back from the stream." "Yes, Aunt." "And Tella?" "Yes, Aunt." "When she comes back from the stream, Do not let her see the seal before I have read it. Tella understood. She nodded once, and she went down the stone stair, and Iron sat alone on the terrace with the wooden horse on one arm of her chair and the letter on the other, and she watched the orchard. The letter, she suspected, was the one she had been waiting 41 years to read. The letter, she suspected, was the goodbye. Owen Merrick, private of the Human 3rd Mountain, had been 22 on the ridge. The medics had taken his leg below the knee, and he had been sent home to his small farming district on the western continent of Earth. And he had married, and he had raised his son, and his son had raised his son, and his son's son had raised his son's son. And Owen Merrick had grown up and grown old, and now, Erin suspected, had grown old enough to leave. He had written to her every year, on the anniversary of the ridge, a short, careful letter, 3 or 4 lines, the human handwriting that Tash had learned to recognize. The letters had said small, ordinary things: the crop, the grandchildren, the weather, the way his wife had laughed at something the dog had done. Iron had answered each one in her own careful hand, and every 5 years, when Tash had been able to travel, the long quiet visit across the rim, Tash and Iron, and the basket of pickled plums and the wooden horse, the days on the porch, the years passing on each other's faces. The last visit had been 2 years ago. The last visit had ended with Owen, very thin, very quiet, sitting on the porch with one hand on Tash's lowered snout and the other hand around a cup of tea that had gone cold, and he had said, in his soft human voice, 3 words that Iron had not been able to make herself answer. Not again, friend, he had meant. Do not come again, he had meant. I do not wish you to see what is coming. Tash had stayed on the porch a long time after Owen had gone inside. The letter on the wicker arm of the chair was, Erin suspected, the news. She did not open it. She watched the orchard. Down by the stream, the great barn shape of Tash and the small, careful shape of the great-grandson were doing the slow work of throwing stones into water. The great-grandson threw with both hands. Tash, with the careful nibbling motion of a creature whose claws had been bred for war, but whose habits had been bred for tenderness, would set a flat stone on the back of her snout and flick her head, and the stone would skip 3 times, and the great-grandson would clap his hands and shriek with joy, and they would do it again. Iron watched them for a long time. The letter sat on the arm of her chair. She thought, in the slow, careful way of very old officers who have spent a long time thinking about loyalty, about what Tash had been on the day of the ridge and what Tash had become, and whether the two were the same. She thought in the end that they were. Tash on the ridge had refused an order. Tash in the orchard 41 years later was honoring the same refusal. The refusal was the same act. The refusal had only changed shape. A creature like Tash, Erin had eventually come to believe, did not choose loyalty the way a council officer chose a flight pattern. A creature like Tash decided, once, who was hers, and after that, every act of her life was the same act, performed again in a different posture, with a different prop, on a different morning, in a different season, for 41 years and counting. The wooden horse was the same horse it had been on the ridge. The boy on the bank was the same man on the stretcher. The stones skipping on the lower stream were the same broken wing reaching out to catch the air. It was all one act. Her people had thought loyalty was a series of acts. It was not. It was one act performed for as long as one was alive. Tash, far below, looked up toward the terrace. The bad wing lifted very slightly in a gesture Iron had come to read over 41 years as a greeting. Iron raised her hand. Tash lowered her head. The great-grandson beside her raised both his small hands. Iron picked the letter up, finally, and broke the seal. The letter was short. It was 4 lines. The hand of the writer was the careful, slow hand of the grandson, the boy who was now 63, the boy who had himself ridden on Tash's shoulder 40 years ago when he was Cor's age. Aunt Iron, the letter began. He went, the second line said, in his sleep on the morning of the 7th, with the dog at the foot of the bed. He asked, the third line said, that the horse be given to the boy. He asked, the fourth line said, that she be told in person. The signature was the name of the grandson, in the careful hand, and beneath the name was a small additional line that Iron read twice before she let herself understand it. He asked, the small additional line said that she come if she could. Iron held the letter for a long time. She did not move. She did not weep. She was past the age of weeping, and her people had never wept in the human way, and the grief, when she let it in, came up through her chest like a slow tide and held there, and did not need to come out. Below, in the orchard, the great-grandson was running back up the slope, his small legs pumping, and the long, careful shape of Tash was walking behind him, the bad wing held out for balance. and the boy was carrying something in his small hand that Iron could not at first see, and then could see. It was a flat skipping stone, smaller than his palm, the gray of the lower riverbed, and he was carrying it the way one carries a small important thing, and Tash, behind him, was walking with her head a little lower than usual. Iron folded the letter once. She put it in the inside pocket of her tunic against her chest. She sat with her hands on her knees, the way she had sat for 50 years on every difficult morning of her life, and she waited. The boy came up the stone stair first, with his stone in his hand, and he held it up to her and said, "Tash gave me this one, did she? To remember the river. That is a good stone for remembering. Will it remember? If you ask it to." The boy looked at his stone. He decided that he would ask it to. He climbed up into Iron's lap the way he had climbed up into her lap every morning since he could walk, and he put the stone on the wicker arm of her chair beside the wooden horse, and he leaned against her chest, and Iron put her old bony arm around him and held him there, and a moment later, on the terrace below, the long, careful shape of Tash came up the lower stair, the one she had been using for 40 years, and stopped at the bottom step and looked at Iron. Tash had always known. It was the thing Iron had spent 41 years failing to put into a sentence she could fit into a report. Tash had always known. On the ridge, when the withdrawal came, she had known what it was costing, and she had refused it anyway. The day Owen Merrick's wife had died, 28 years ago, Tash had been 3 rim jumps away on the long, quiet patrol Iron had chosen as her exile, and she had turned, without orders, 3 days before the news could have reached them, and she had flown the wrong direction for 2 solid days, and they had arrived at Owen's farm on the morning of the funeral, and Tash had lain down on the grass beside the house and not moved for 3 days, and Owen had sat with his hand on her snout for all 3 of them, and the dog had slept between them. Tash had always known. She knew now. Iron saw it in the angle of the long, careful head at the bottom of the lower stair. She saw it in the way the bad wing was not stretched out for balance but tucked slightly against the flank, the way one tucks a thing that has been used too hard and needs to rest. She saw it in the yellow eye, which was not bright with the orchard sun anymore but quiet. The quiet that had been in it on the porch 2 years ago when Owen had said, "Not again, friend." Iron met the yellow eye. She said in the squadron tongue, "He is gone." Tash lowered her head until her snout touched the bottom step of the lower stair and held it there. The boy in Iron's lap looked up at his great-grandmother's face. He was 4. He did not understand the words. He understood the silence. He understood the way the long, careful shape at the bottom of the stair was holding itself. He looked at his stone on the wicker arm of the chair and at the wooden horse beside it, and he said very quietly, "Is Tash sad?" "Yes, why?" "Because the man who gave her the horse is gone." The boy thought about that. He had not known the man. The man had been a face in a photograph on the wall in his grandmother's parlor, a face under a brown straw hat with a brown dog at his knee, the face of someone called Grandpa Owen, who had lived very far away and whom the boy had never met. The boy looked at the photograph in his head, and he looked at the long, careful shape at the bottom of the stair, and he climbed down out of Iron's lap, and he picked up the wooden horse, and he carried it down the stair, careful foot by careful foot, and he walked across the terrace to where Tash was standing with her snout on the bottom step, and he held the wooden horse up. "Tash," he said. Tash opened her yellow eye. "You can have it back," the boy said, "if you need it." Iron on the terrace put one hand over her mouth in the gesture her people use for the catching of a sound that should not be let out. Tash looked at the boy. Tash looked at the wooden horse. Tash, very gently, lowered her great snout until it touched the top of the horse, and the boy very gravely, the way only small children can be grave, held it up to her, and she did not take it. She did not need to take it. She closed her yellow eye once, the long, slow blink that her people used for attention and respect, and she lifted her snout, and she dipped her head to the boy the way she had dipped her head to Iron on the terrace earlier that morning, and the boy understood. The way small children sometimes understand things that no adult could have explained to them, and he hugged the wooden horse to his chest, and he sat down on the bottom step of the lower stair beside her great folded leg, and he leaned his small back against the warm scales of her ankle, and he did not move. They stayed there a long time. Iron on the terrace stayed in her chair. The morning sun moved across the orchard. The shadows of the lemon trees shortened. Somewhere very far below, in the lower valley, a flight of carrier hawks went over in formation, the way they went over every morning at this hour, and Tash's good ear tracked them across the sky, and then forgot them. The boy fell asleep against her ankle, the wooden horse held against his chest. And Tash, with the slow, careful precision she did everything with, lifted the broken wing, not stretched this time, but curved, and laid it down over him like a roof, and the bad wing, which had been bad for 41 years, did one of the things it had been bad at for 41 years, which was the slow, patient sheltering of a sleeping child of the Merrick line. Iron watched. She watched for a long time. After a while, she got up out of the wicker chair, slowly on her bad hip, and she went down the stone stair, careful foot by careful foot, and she crossed the terrace and stood at the bottom of the lower stair beside Tash's great folded leg, and she put one hand on the warm scales above the bad wing. "It is time," she said in the squadron tongue. Tash opened the yellow eye. "He asked," Iron said, "that we come if we could." The grandson asked, "The funeral is on the morning after tomorrow. The lower river cottage, the same porch." Tash held her gaze. "It is a long flight," Iron said. "It will be hard on the wing. I would not ask you to make it. I will go on the council courier if you cannot." Tash very slowly lifted the wing. She lifted it the way she had lifted it on the ridge. Not the good wing, but the bad one, the one that had refused 41 years ago to leave a man on a burning slope. She lifted it out to the side, fully the way the wingmasters had said she would never lift it again, and she held it out at the full extension of the joint that had broken at the Tannish crossing and never quite reset, and the bad wing, which was the wing of an old creature who had spent 41 years walking, instead of flying, trembled in the morning air, but it held the angle. Iron put her hand on the leading edge of it. "Yes," she said quietly. "All right, we will go together." Tash dipped her head. The boy, against her ankle, did not stir. The packing was not much, it never was. The Haluvos household had been ready for one last trip across the rim for 41 years. The flight harness for Tash was in the lower barn, oiled. The traveling pack for Iron was in the hall closet, the leather worn smooth by her own hand, the jar of the dark spiced tea Owen had liked, the wool blanket, the small leather case with the photographs and the letters of 41 years, the careful annual record that Iron had begun the first year, and Owen had begun the same year, and that she now closed the buckle on, for the last time, with her old hand steady. Tella came down to the lower barn at the second hour after noon. "Aunt Iron." "Tella, are you sure?" "I am sure. It is a long flight on her wing, it is." "Mother said," "I know what your mother said. Tell your mother I have not yet, in 83 years, taken her advice on this matter. Tell her I am not about to start." Tella smiled. The small, careful smile of a young woman who had been raised to wait on an old one, and she helped Iron with the harness, and the stable hand brought Tash up out of the orchard, and they laid the long, oiled straps across her shoulders, the way they had laid them across her shoulders every 5 years for 41 years, and Tash lowered her great head, the way she always lowered it for the harness, and Iron climbed up onto her shoulder by the small worn ladder she had used since she was 60. The boy on the bottom step of the lower stair was awake again. He came down to the barn with the wooden horse in his hand. He stood at Tash's foot. He looked up at Iron on Tash's shoulder. "Are you going to where Grandpa was?" he said. "Yes. Will you tell him I have his horse?" Iron looked down at the small upturned face and the brown hair and the solemn mouth of Owen Merrick's great-grandson, and she thought, for one bright instant, that her people had been right after all to have no word for it, because the word was always going to be too small for the thing it had to hold. "I will tell him," she said. The boy nodded. "And tell Tash, when you come back," he said, "that I will give the stone to her too if she needs it. I will tell her." The boy held the wooden horse up against his chest and he stepped back, and Tash, with the slow, careful precision of a creature who had been growing for 41 years, raised her bad wing fully out for balance, and her good wing in the great sweep that lifted them off the floor of the lower barn, and they were in the air, the way they had been in the air on the ridge, and they were going west. The flight took 2 days. They flew the long, quiet course Tash had flown every 5 years, across the rim, across the inner approach to Earth where the human controllers, who had known Tash by sight for 30 years, cleared a quiet lane for her without being asked. They landed once on a small refueling station, and Iron, waking and looking out, saw Tash standing against the stars with her bad wing extended to the night sky, and she thought, as she had thought 1,000 times, that her people had never bred a finer soldier and never recognized one. They came down at the lower river on the morning of the funeral. The cottage was the same cottage. The porch was the same porch. The brown dog at the door was a different brown dog, the son of the son of the son of the brown dog who had been at the door on the first visit, and he came down the steps with the slow, careful greeting of a country dog who knew Tash the way. Country dogs know an old friend they have seen at intervals all their lives. The grandson was on the porch. He was 63. He had Owen's brown hair gone silver. He had Owen's quiet mouth. He came down the steps with both hands held out, and Iron climbed down off Tash's shoulder by the small worn ladder she always carried in the harness pocket, and the grandson took her 2 old hands in his 2 old hands. And he did not say anything for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, in the human tongue, "He left this for you." He held up a small wooden box. Iron took it. She did not open it on the porch. She put it in the inside pocket of her tunic, against her chest beside the letter. The funeral was small. Owen Merrick had not been a famous man. He had been a quiet farmer on the lower river all his long life. And the people in the chapel were neighbors and the family, and 3 old men in pressed dark suits, who had been in the 3rd mountain with him on the ridge, and who looked at Erin and Tash when they came in and stood up, all 3 slowly on their old legs, and dipped their heads in the human way that meant respect. Erin dipped her head back. Tash, who could not enter the chapel, lay down outside in the long grass beyond the chapel wall, and she put her snout on the low stone of the chapel garden, and she did not move. The service was short. The grandson read the 4 lines of the letter Owen had left for the chapel, and then he read one more line, which had been added at the bottom, beneath the careful signature. The line, the grandson said, was written in Owen's hand on the morning of the day he had gone. The line read, "Tell her I held the line." The chapel was very quiet. The 3 old men in the dark suits looked at Erin. Iron looked back at them. The line had been the human 3rd Mountain's order on the ridge. The order that had come down from their captain, the order Owen had been holding when the fragment took his leg, the order Erin had relayed to her squadron in the second of her 2 shouts. Hold the line, he had held it. For 41 years, in his quiet way, on his small farm, in his small house with his careful annual letter, he had held it. Erin bowed her head. Outside the chapel, against the low stone wall, Tash, who had heard the line through the open window, closed her yellow eye. After the chapel, they walked the small, slow walk to the grave on the hill above the lower river, and the grandson very gently gave Iron the wooden box, and Iron opened it at the grave the way Owen had asked her to. Inside the box was a single small carved object. It was a creature the size of her palm. It was carved in the same hand that had carved the wooden horse 41 years ago. In the field hospital on the planet Drath, in the 3rd month after the ridge, it was a small dragon with a broken wing. Iron held it. She held it a long time. Tash, behind her, lowered her great head over Iron's shoulder and looked down at the small carved creature in Iron's old hand, and the long, careful angle of her own bad wing was the same angle as the angle of the carved wing in Erin's palm. And Erin, who had been past the age of weeping for 40 years, found herself on the small hill above the lower river, weeping after all, because there were some things she discovered at 83 that her people had been wrong about. She wept for some time. Tash stood with her over the grave. The grandson behind them said nothing. He had known what the small carved creature was. He had known what the bad wing was. He gave them the time. After a while, Iron put the small carved creature back in the box, and she set the box on top of the gravestone. And she said one thing very quietly in the squadron tongue, which neither the grandson nor the dog nor the 3 old men in their dark suits would have understood. She said, "He held the line, and so did you, and I have been honored to know you both." Then she turned, and she walked back down the small, slow hill, and Tash walked beside her with the bad wing held out for balance, and the grandson followed, and the brown dog followed the grandson, and the long, quiet afternoon came down on the lower river the way it had come down on every afternoon Iron had ever spent in that country. They stayed 2 more days at the cottage. They sat on the porch. They told the grandson the small old stories, the ones that had not been in the annual letters because the annual letters had not been the right place for them. The story of the first visit, 25 years after the ridge, when Owen had still been able to walk, and Tash had been smaller, and they had ridden together up the lower river in a flat boat the grandson's father had built. The story of the time Tash had eaten a whole crate of pickled plums by mistake and had to lie down on the porch for 3 days. The story of the time Owen had taught Tash to skip stones on the bank of the same lower river the great-grandson now skipped them on, and Tash had been very bad at it for the first hour and then very good at it for the rest of her life. The grandson listened. The grandson, who was 63, who had been Core's age when Tash had first set him on her shoulder, who had grown up with her great careful shape in the background of every important morning of his life, who had, in his careful human way, kept Owen's annual letters going for the last 2 years when Owen had been too weak to write them himself. The grandson listened, and at the end of the third evening on the porch, with the sun going down over the lower river and the brown dog asleep at his feet, he said the thing that Iron had come to hear him say. He was glad you came, Aunt Iron, the last time. 2 years ago. He said so after. He said he had been afraid you would not. I almost did not, I know. He told me not to, I know. He told me later he was sorry he had told you not to. He said it was the only thing in the visit he wished he could take back. Tell him, Iron began, and then stopped, because there was no longer anyone to tell. Tell. The grandson smiled the small, careful smile of a man who had loved his grandfather. I will tell him, he said, in the way one tells. He will know. Iron put her old hand over the grandson's old hand. You are a good man, she said, like your father, like his father. I had good teaching. You did, and you taught it forward. The boy will be all right. He will be all right. On the morning of the fourth day, they flew east. The flight back was slower. Tash's bad wing had paid for the trip out, and she flew low, and she landed twice for rest, and the second time on a small green moon in the middle approach. Iron slept 8 hours and dreamed of the ridge, the way she had dreamed of the ridge most nights of her life. And in the dream the small one would not lift, and the smoke came up the slope, and Iron bent down beside the stretcher, and the dream this time was not a dream of fear. It was a dream of the right answer given again, in a different posture, in a different season, for the 42nd time. When they came down at last on the upper terrace of the Haluvas home on the planet Aral, the orchard was in the long shadow of evening, and the lemon trees were holding the last of the day's light. And the great-grandson was on the bottom step of the lower stair with the wooden horse in one hand and the small flat skipping stone in the other. He stood up. He waited for Tash to fold her bad wing. He walked across the courtyard with both hands held out, the careful way he had been raised to walk toward the long quiet shape of his great-grandmother's old friend. He held the wooden horse up. He held the small flat stone up. For you, he said to Tash. Tash lowered her great head until her snout was even with the boy. She looked at the wooden horse. She looked at the small flat stone. She looked at the small upturned face of the great-grandson of the man whose stretcher she had refused to leave 41 years ago on a burning ridge half a galaxy away. She did not take the horse. She did not take the stone. She lowered her snout very gently until it rested for one full breath against the boy's small chest in the gesture she had used once on a stretcher with a wounded man's good hand on the side of her face, and she held it there for a count of 3 in the squadron tongue, the same count Iron had used on the ridge, and then she lifted her head. The bad wing dipped very slightly, a greeting, a keeping. The boy understood. He held the wooden horse against his chest with both hands, and he held the small flat stone tight in his fist, and he sat down at the foot of Tash's great folded leg, the way he had sat the morning of the letter, and he leaned his small back against the warm scales, and the bad wing came down over him like a roof, and he closed his eyes. Iron, climbing slowly down the small worn ladder, watched. She thought, in the quiet way of very old officers who have spent a long time thinking about loyalty, that this was the resolution, not the report, not the rank, not the letter, and not the line in the chapel, and not the small carved creature on the stone at the top of the hill above the lower river. The resolution was a child asleep against a bad wing in the evening light of an orchard, and an old soldier coming down a ladder, and a creature who had refused once to lift and who was still, in the only way that mattered, in the slow, patient, unending act that had begun 41 years ago and would end only when she did, refusing, the fifth word, the one her people had no word for, the one she had spent a life learning to recognize. It was here. It had been here all along. It would be here tomorrow. She set her good foot on the flagstone of the courtyard, and she stood for a moment with her hand on the lower rung of the ladder, and she looked at the small sleeping shape of the great-grandson against the long careful shape of Tash. And she thought about Owen Merrick, and the wooden horse, and the carved small dragon in the small box on the gravestone above the lower river, and the 4 lines in the 5th, the careful added line. Tell her I held the line. She had told her. She had told her in the chapel, and Tash had closed her eye. The bad wing, in the evening light, lifted slightly, a fraction of a degree, the smallest gesture of a creature who had been signaling small gestures for 41 years. The greeting, the keeping, the promise that the morning would come and that she would be carrying a basket across the orchard, and the boy would come up the stone stair, and the long, slow act would begin again and again, and for as long as there were Merricks for it to be done for, and Haluvoses to watch it being done, and old officers on terraces to know, with the slow certainty of a life spent watching, that loyalty was not a series of acts. It was one act, performed for as long as one was alive, and, Iron thought, walking slowly across the courtyard in the long evening light of the orchard, with the wooden horse and the small flat stone safe in the hand of a sleeping boy under a broken wing, and, she thought, sometimes, in the long quiet kindness of the universe, performed for a little while longer than that. She bent down, with her bad hip protesting, and she put one old hand on the warm scale of Tash's lowered ankle. "Thank you," she said quietly, in the human tongue Owen had taught her. "Old friend, thank you for not lifting." Tash opened her yellow eye once. The eye held hers, the eye closed. The orchard kept its long evening light a moment longer, and then the light went, and the cool of the planet Errol came down on the upper terrace garden, and the great-grandson slept under the broken wing, and the old sub-commander sat down on the bottom step of the lower stair beside her old friend, and the three of them stayed there together, exactly as they were, until the first stars came out over the lower valley.